Okay, so thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me. I'm ridiculously excited to be here today. So I'm going to be talking to you about using MRI to measure body composition. And Jimmy Bell and the audience and I started this project about 30 years ago. And everybody, particularly people in the imaging community, thought this was a terrible idea. Why would you want to use good MRI time for measuring fat, which is something everybody wanted to get rid of? And part of that is because most studies thought we already had all we knew for population health and genetics. People just use things like body mass index, calculated from your weight and height, or if you want to be really fancy, maybe waist to hip ratio. And lots of knowledge was just based on this, but it's really easy to see how looks don't tell you everything. I mean, my favourite one-person example is Arnie in his prime. He had a BMI of 30, which made him obese. Later on in life, when he went into politics and it all slipped a little bit, his BMI was 29, so he's now overweight. So he's become healthier in that time. But it's not just Arnie, it's all of us. You can have an identical BMI and completely different amounts of visceral fat. That's the fat that's bad for you. So the green fat on the image. And it's exactly the same for waist circumference. So if you want to see what's going on in the body, you have to measure it directly. But it's not just fat, even though fat is the most interesting thing in the body. It's actually the same for muscle. You can have an identical BMI, completely different levels of muscle mass, and the quality of your muscle changes. Now, that's not something we think about on a day-to-day basis. If you think about when you go and buy a steak, you see the marbling in the steak. That's what's happening to us as we age. Our steaks, our muscles are becoming more marbled with age, and this is really important for disease, frailty, quality of life. So the only answer really to understand the body in depth is to use imaging. And we really need a very big imaging study. When we started, an imaging study of maybe 12 people would be quite the achievement. And then the UK Biobank came along and said, we're going to scan 100,000 people. Being the doubting Thomas, I think there's a lot of us in the room, we all thought this was crazy and it would be impossible. This is 100,000 people. How on earth can you MRI scan this many people? Rory and the UK Biobank, somehow they did it. And then we had other concerns. How do you analyse the images of 100,000 people? So when we did our fat scanning, it would take about an hour to acquire the scans. It then take me a day to manually analyse one person's images. So to measure the images in the UK Biobank manually and measure everything, we predicted it would take thousands of years. So clearly it wasn't practical that I would label them all by hand. So we worked with Spectrum Banjo in the audience here, developing the liver sequences, faster ones for the biobank, and another company, AMRA, to look at the body fat in a faster way. And initially our goals were actually quite small. We were going to look at fat, liver, pancreas, maybe muscle, and that was about it. But we needed to have a completely different approach. So we've worked with Calico in the States, and lots of this work is led by my brilliant colleague Brandon, and we've developed a completely automated way to analyse the images. And part of what we do is we manually label, say, 200 images, and we train a deep learning model to analyse the data automatically. And now, instead of thousands of years, we can look at everything in the body in a matter of minutes. And now the people who are interested in genetics can actually do their big data studies on real and relevant measurements rather than indirect proxies. Now, we've moved on massively since our days of fat, and we can measure everything in the body. So all our organs, we can look at the substructures of organs. My colleagues Maria and Marilee did fantastic projects looking at the shape of organs. We can look at fat everywhere, the muscle, we can look at all your bones. And what's really, really interesting is we can look at the quality of what's inside your body. Are you storing lots of fat and iron in those tissues? So looking at fat, I mean, it's really great. We can paint. We've evolved to be so clever. We can store fat everywhere. But now with the biobank data, we can not only measure it, we can look to see how it changes with aging and at population levels. So we've done a lot with that. One of the first studies we did was looking at accumulation of fat in the liver in the biobank. We found 20% of the UK Biobank participants had too much fat in the liver, which sounds scary. I mean, for some people, little lifestyle change, it'll go away. But a small proportion are going to have inflammation, progressive liver disease, and that is a problem, especially when you scale it up to the UK population. And we've done similar studies looking at iron and the inflammation in the liver, which I think Banjo will cover in his talk. We've done studies on how your dietary fat composition affects your adipose tissue composition. Now, we did this previously in very small studies, very detailed studies, but we've never been able to do it in enough numbers to see how this relates to disease, how it changes in aging. This is another Maria's project where she looks at the shape of the organs. So in a study like this, she can measure the thickness of your fat everywhere all at once. It's quite extraordinary. And again, we can see how thickness in certain places is really predictive of future disease development. Now, muscle's one of the most important things in our body. It's something we don't often think about. So we can look at overall muscle and see how that relates to disease, but we can look at the shape of individual muscles. We can map all the individual muscles in the images. So our technology is quite extraordinary now. Some of the examples of things we've done, if you look at muscle on a whole body level, we can see as how we age, we lose muscle and our bodies become fatter, the sarcopenia of old age. But we can see as our muscles become fatty, we become frail, which has huge implications for quality of life. We can look at individuals like the psoas, which is really predictive of health and well-being. My colleague Brandon's leading a really interesting study for future prediction of type 2 diabetes. In some individual thigh muscles are much more important than others. This lends itself to really targeted therapies in the future. My colleague Micah has done a really interesting study combining the imaging data with all the rich information in the biobank about people's lives. And she can predict early onset of disease. Are you likely to get Parkinson's in your 60s or in your 70s? What's been really interesting for me is that even though we have all the blood biochemistry data, it's the imaging metrics that are coming out in the top 5 predictors of most of the diseases. Other things we've done. The way we looked at the images, if somebody's going to come along to a UK biobank centre, spend 5 hours having their examinations, are responsible to extract every little bit of information from these images. And we can now label about 95% of all the pixels in the body. So this is a study we did with Calico, and we measured spleen iron in everybody, which I thought was a very boring thing to do because what spleen's for at the end of the day. But now they've run the genetics, we've been able to explain why some people get a mild form of hereditary spherocytosis, a blood disorder, and why some people get a really severe phenotype. Now, we would never have had this information before because people don't routinely collect measures like this in the population. We were able to predict who was more likely to get severe COVID based on the amount of visceral fat they had. My colleague Nick, he developed a method to automatically detect abdominal aortic aneurysms. Now, these methods can be rolled out into clinical medicine. And then for me, this was probably the study that changed my life personally, because I've taken this on board. I'm sure maybe you will too at the end of this. But this was the very early rescanning study the Biobank did, where we looked at people before and after 2 years, which is extraordinary. You would never get funding to do an intervention where you did nothing and just scan people twice. But in 2 years, people increased the amount of visceral fat, their muscles became fattier, their aorta diameter increased, and they accumulated more iron in the liver, which is really important for accelerating that liver disease process. Their organs mostly shrunk, but they lost muscle, total muscle, regional muscle, and their muscles became fattier. Now, we had evidence, we had like blood pressure increased, grip strength, so lots of things we know are bad things. So this is really our decline in just 2 years. So for me, I'm now doing my 10,000 steps a day and like really increase my activity, because how can doing nothing for such a short period of time have such a big change? So I will leave it there. I'm at time, and I would just like to thank, you're all going to do your steps today, the Biobank who's made all this work possible, the volunteers, our team-ups at the Research Centre for Optimal Health, who are just brilliant people, and obviously Calico, who are huge funders of our research. So thank you so much.